Last week, I ran into an old college friend at a quiet, dimly lit cafe. This was a guy who used to talk incessantly about manifesting greatness, but now he sat there staring at the bottom of his cup like it held a death warrant. When I asked him why he'd quit his latest project, he didn't give me a logistical reason. He just sighed and said, "It's just not my fate, man. I'm tired of fighting against a script I didn't write." And he was strangely calm about it, almost smug in his defeat. He even showed me this post he'd saved on his phone about surrendering to the universe, and he was using it as a shield, a way to justify his own paralysis. To him, the fact that things were difficult was just ironclad proof that he was, quote, destined to fail. He had this idealized version of himself in his head, a version that never struggled, and because he wasn't that person yet, he decided the universe was actively blocking his path. He kept talking about a wall in front of him, and he was just convinced that whatever lay behind it was probably just more disappointment. But then something small happened. The sky outside suddenly opened up into a total downpour. A woman at the next table, she realized she'd left her car windows down and, she panicked. Without a second thought, my friend, the guy who just said he was done fighting, grabbed his umbrella, ran out into the rain, and helped her cover the windows. He came back soaked and shivering, but for the first time that afternoon, his eyes were actually bright. That instantaneous shift from a man paralyzed by a pre-written failure to a man who instinctively took control of a chaotic moment, it was jarring. It made me realize that his obsession with fate wasn't a stable philosophy. It was a slow-acting poison. We spend so much time cursing the wall in front of us, assuming we know what's on the other side, that we forget we are the ones who decide whether to climb in or sit in its shadow. We talk about finding our purpose as if it's a hidden treasure, but what if our purpose is simply the result of the actions we choose to take right now? Why is it that we let the assumption of a destined future kill the person we are actually capable of becoming today? Okay, so let's unpack this, because that moment, that spontaneous action where my friend instinctively chose to help despite having just declared himself defeated by fate, it really reveals the central tension in all our lives.
It absolutely does.
We are constantly negotiating the space between what we believe is predetermined and the absolute freedom we inherently possess.
Right.
We're talking about the deep psychological transition required to shift from that kind of fatalistic nihilism to proactive self-actualization.
And what's so fascinating here is that the friend's paralysis, it came from an assumption of failure. He was essentially cursing a wall without knowing what was behind it.
He'd already decided the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. So our deep dive today is about dismantling that wall. We're going to integrate some practical Stoic principles with the radical demands of existentialism and the profound insights of meaning-centered psychology.
And the goal here is to show exactly how to reclaim that personal agency against the weight of expectations, whether they're real or just imagined.
The mission is really to provide you, the listener, with the intellectual tools you need to shift your focus from some pre-written destiny to immediate intentional action.
That opening story, it's the perfect setup for where we have to start, which is getting practical right out of the gate. We need a way to filter the noise of external life.
Absolutely. The core concept here is overcoming that decision paralysis.
And the root of that paralysis, like we saw with my friend, it's that impulse to just blame fate.
Blaming fate or, pointing to that impenetrable wall in front of us is fundamentally a form of self-sabotage.
How so? I mean, it feels more like resignation.
Well, think of it as a cognitive shortcut. Our brains are wired to seek certainty, right? But the world is inherently messy and unpredictable.
Right.
So by declaring failure or a tough spot to be fate, you instantly achieve a kind of certainty. It might be a negative certainty, but it's certainty nonetheless.
And crucially, it lets you off the hook.
It absolutely lets you off the hook. It allows you to avoid the terrifying responsibility of choice. When you surrender to an idea of destiny, you don't have to put in the effort. And if you fail, hey, it wasn't your fault.
It sounds like a psychological defense mechanism, just dressed up as some kind of high philosophy.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's so much more comforting to believe that if you fail, you were just the victim of some grand cosmic plan, rather than, the person who maybe quit 3 weeks too soon.
So this is where the ancient wisdom comes in. How does Stoicism give us the filter we need to pierce through that illusion of determinism and, just start moving again?
It introduces what's called the Stoic Filter, the dichotomy of control. This framework, developed and taught most famously by Epictetus, a man who was born a slave and yet became one of the most influential moral philosophers, is ruthlessly practical.
Ruthlessly practical. I like that.
It is. It's an exercise in clear identification and separation. And it's especially useful for someone who feels completely lost and overwhelmed, provided they simply choose to keep living and observing.
Okay, so let's really break down those two categories. Let's spend some time here because this feels like where the day-to-day resilience is actually built, what is firmly in our control.
What's in our control is a very, very short list. It's strictly our own opinions, our reactions, our attitudes, and our choices, our own actions. That's it.
So the internal world.
The internal world. This is the ultimate non-negotiable territory of personal sovereignty. Epictetus put it beautifully when he defined the core task of life. He said it was to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control.
So the whole game is just sorting things into two buckets.
That's the game. And therefore, he argued, we should look for good and evil not in those uncontrollable externals, but strictly within the choices that are our own. The internal motivation, the integrity of the process, the effort you put in, that's all yours.
Wow, that completely flips the script on how we assign value to things, doesn't it?
It does.
It means if I'm working on a project, the virtue of that act isn't tied to whether the project succeeds or fails in the end. It's tied to the honesty, the dedication, the diligence I bring to the effort itself.
Precisely. If the company goes under, that's an external event. But if you skimped on your work, if you cut corners and acted dishonestly, that internal choice is the true failure.
Okay, so then the flip side, what falls into that other bucket, the not in our control or externals, that list has to be much longer.
Oh, that category is vast. It's where most people spend 90% of their emotional and cognitive energy. It includes the actions of others. You cannot control whether your spouse, your colleague, or a political leader does the right thing.
Right.
It includes our health, the weather, the outcomes of our efforts, and of course the future itself. We can put in virtuous, perfect effort. You can run a flawless race. But if you trip on a hidden route or the market crashes, the outcome is still subject to the randomness of the universe.
The Stoic realization then is that wasting emotional energy on these externals is just. It's futile. It's madness to sit around fretting over the rain or the economy.
It is. But it's incredibly difficult for us in the modern world. We are bombarded with news and events, giving us this illusion that if we just worry harder or analyze more, we can somehow prevent catastrophe.
It's funny you mention that because this ancient philosophy is perfectly reflected in modern coping mechanisms. You see this dichotomy, this exact idea in something as common as the serenity prayer.
Absolutely. The acceptance of what cannot be changed and the courage to change what can. It's a direct echo of Epictetus, just translated into a spiritual practice.
And it's a powerful translation because the practical application is so clear. It moves past just understanding the world to giving you a directive for action. It's a mechanism for managing your internal energy.
100%. Imagine you're reviewing your job performance. A colleague was promoted over you. The Stoic Filter forces you to ask, what did I control?
My diligence, my time management, my attitude.
Exactly. And what did you not control?
The boss's bias, my colleague's political maneuvering, the company's financial climate, a dozen other things.
And the only constructive path forward is to improve the things you control and simply accept the things you don't. Any other path leads to endless resentment and, well, paralysis.
But, sometimes stoicism gets a bad rap, especially when you're facing widespread injustice. People think it means being apathetic or indifferent, just lying down and accepting everything, including systemic flaws.
That is a critical misunderstanding, and it's a very common one.
Right. If the system is broken, the Stoic says, well, I accept the outcome of the system, which to a lot of people sounds like complicity. How do they avoid becoming just cynical or passive observers?
Because the Stoic goal is not apathy or indifference. It is resilience and virtue. The virtue they seek allows us to bear suffering with dignity and prevents us from being destroyed or overwhelmed by it.
So it's not about not caring, it's about not breaking.
Precisely. It's about focusing our energy efficiently. And we can look at that as a kind of emotional triage.
Emotional triage. I like that analogy. Explain what that looks like in practice, especially when you're dealing with something complex and external, like societal injustice.
Okay, so the philosophy allows us to feel emotion, say sadness at a tragedy or anger at an injustice. But it prevents us from being so completely overcome and paralyzed by those feelings that we can no longer act.
You don't get drowned in it.
You don't.
Yeah.
You reserve your strong feelings for the things you can actually affect. If you are angry about a widespread structural injustice, you don't sink into despair over the magnitude of the problem itself, which you cannot control. Instead, you focus your control on your actions, volunteering, voting, organizing, lobbying, or even just maintaining your own internal moral compass while fighting the good fight.
So the critique that Stoicism encourages accepting flawed systems is based on confusing control over outcomes with control over effort.
Exactly that. If I spend all my time worrying about whether my activism will successfully reform the entire system overnight, I will burn out in a week.
And achieve nothing.
And achieve nothing. The Stoic idea of virtue actually encourages robust, sustained action and cooperation to better the community. It demands that we act virtuously in society. We control the effort, not the result.
So a group of Stoics could actually be very effective activists.
Incredibly effective. If a collective of people all acting virtuously and focusing only on their efforts rather than guaranteed success works together, they can enact radical change. The collective impact they produced is proportional to the number of people committed to that virtuous action. The virtue is enduring the hardship involved in fighting for that change without complaint, which allows you to sustain the effort long term.
You stop letting the difficulty of the task define its impossibility.
You've got it. That shift in focus is huge. Instead of, I failed and the system is flawed, I give up, it's, I controlled my effort, I acted virtuously, and I will continue to act, regardless of the immediate result.
This helps you manage external reality, but that only leaves us alone with ourselves, which I think is where the real challenge begins, right? The challenge of absolute choice.
That's the exact pivot point. If Stoicism provides the internal management system for external reality, existentialism demands we confront the internal reality, our absolute radical freedom.
We move from accepting limits to defining limits.
This is where we leave the comforting structure of ancient wisdom and plunge headfirst into the terrifying demands of modern philosophy.
And we're moving into the realm of Jean-Paul Sartre, who was, the leading figure of 20th century existentialism. His work really emerged from the moral wreckage of World War II.
It did. After the collapse of all these traditional religious and political certainties, he just rejected so many comforting notions about human nature. He argued that humans are radically free and therefore radically responsible.
And at the foundation of all of his thought is maybe the most famous philosophical claim of the entire movement, the one that directly attacked that idea of a pre-written script.
Existence precedes essence.
Right. And that is a true philosophical reckoning for anyone looking for a divine plan or some kind of predetermined purpose.
It really is.
So let's really unpack that claim properly, because it feels like the core engine of the entire movement. What is the fundamental difference between existence and essence in the Sartrean context?
Okay, so essence refers to a predetermined nature or purpose. Think of an artifact, a manufactured object. Sartre often used the analogy of a paper knife.
Okay, a paper knife.
Before the paper knife exists, the artisan has a concept in their mind, its purpose, its design, its specific form. The essence, the purpose and design, precedes the existence. Its nature dictates its function.
It's built for something.
Exactly. Humans, Sartre argued, are fundamentally different. We are not manufactured with a divine plan or a purpose or a fixed nature. We are born into the world as nothing, simply a conscious presence.
We just are.
We first exist. We encounter ourselves. We surge up in the world, and only afterward do we define ourselves through our actions, our choices, our projects. We are constantly in the process of becoming.
So, unlike that paper knife, we don't come with an instruction manual. Every definition of who we are, I am a good parent, I am a skilled engineer, I am a failure, that all comes solely from ourselves.
Solely. We are the sole author of our being, and until we act, we are nothing.
Wow.
There is no fixed human nature. There is no divine plan to rely on. The core implication of this is profound. A person becomes who they make themselves through their decisions, and your life has no significance beyond what you yourself choose to give it.
So if you're waiting for a job title or some external achievement to validate your purpose, you're waiting for an essence that doesn't exist until you create it.
You're waiting for Godot.
Right. This realization sounds, on one hand, utterly liberating, but Sartre famously called this condition a condemnation. We're condemned to be free. Where does the condemnation come from?
The terror comes from the burden of absolute freedom and the absolute lack of any external justification for our choices.
What do you mean by that?
Freedom is not something we acquire gradually or that we earn. It is intrinsic to our existence from the very start. Sartre said, "There is no difference between the being of man and his being free. We cannot escape it."
So even deciding not to decide is a decision?
Precisely. Even choosing to follow a set of rules or submit to an authority is ultimately an act of free choice that you are responsible for.
So my friend at the cafe, saying his failure was fate, he was just using the concept of fate as a rhetorical shield.
He was. He was still making a choice, the choice to stop fighting. And he was responsible for that resignation. We can't blame fate or God or nature for our condition. Everything we do shapes us. And that weight of total inescapable responsibility, that's the condemnation.
And it's terrifying because it's not just about your life. It opens up these infinite possibilities for self-creation, but it also forces us to confront three profound existential experiences that arise from that freedom, concepts identified by Sartre and Søren Kierkegaard before him.
We have to confront anguish, abandonment, and despair.
Okay, let's take the time to differentiate these terms from how we use them every day, because they are philosophical terms of art. Let's start with anguish.
Anguish, or l'angoisse, is the feeling that arises when we realize that nothing limits our freedom, which means every decision depends entirely on us. It is the anxiety of total responsibility.
But it's more than just being scared of the consequences.
So much more. The key nuance is that this anguish isn't just fear of what might happen. It's the awareness that our choices don't just define ourselves, what we are. They also set an example of what humanity could be.
Okay, hold on. That's a massive leap. How does my choice to order coffee or not set an example for all of humanity?
Because in making any choice, you are acting without a guide, you are asserting a value, and you're implicitly stating, I choose this for myself, and I believe this is what a human being ought to be in this situation.
So if I choose to be lazy in a moment, I am on some level advocating for the possibility of the lazy humanity.
That's the Sartrean view. He wrote, "It is in anguish that man becomes conscious of his freedom." Anguish, therefore, is that dizzying feeling of realizing you are the lawmaker for yourself, and by extension, for all of human possibility.
That adds an incredible moral weight to every trivial choice, and it explains why decision paralysis is so common. It's overwhelming.
It is.
If there's no external guide to rely on, only my own judgment, it's no wonder people flee toward the comfort of fate. Which brings us to the second consequence, abandonment.
Abandonment, or délaissement, is the realization that no divine plan or pre-written moral law gives life meaning. It's the consequence of that famous Dostoevsky line that Sartre adapted. If God did not exist, everything would be permitted.
Meaning, if there is no divine source for morals, we have to invent them ourselves.
We have to. Values must be created by humans. We are, in his words, forlorn, left completely alone to create value. We are abandoned in the world, without help, engaged in a world for which we bear the whole responsibility.
So the emotional fallout of realizing your career choices, your relationships, your entire existence are fundamentally meaningless to an indifferent universe, and you alone have to justify the 60 hours you put in this week. That feeling is abandonment.
Yes, that's the realization that you are fundamentally alone in the act of valuation.
And for Sartre, this isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, it isn't necessarily despairing in the everyday sense. It's a radical clarity meaning must be created, not discovered. Which leads us to the third consequence, which is often deeply misunderstood: despair.
This term is almost always confused with simple hopelessness, but Sartre used it in a very constructive way.
He did. Philosophical despair, or désespoir, is the constructive understanding that we can only rely on what depends entirely on us, our actions. We can't control the future or the environment or the actions of others, and yet we must continue to act.
We have to rely on probabilities, not guarantees.
Exactly. This is the Stoic filter applied to the existential crisis. The moment you realize you can't control the outcome, that's Stoicism, you are forced to define yourself purely by the effort. That's Sartre.
So despair means recognizing that all the possibilities that freedom creates are only realized through action.
Yes. Sartre famously noted, life begins on the other side of despair. These three experiences, anguish, abandonment, and despair, they're not obstacles to be avoided. They are the inevitable, essential consequences of human freedom. They are the cost of self-creation.
And confronting these consequences head-on, refusing to flinch away from the anxiety they generate, that leads us directly to what Sartre called the heroic ethics of authenticity.
Authenticity requires accepting this absolute freedom and taking full, unwavering responsibility for one's life. We must turn freedom to action, defining our own values through our choices. Authenticity is not a passive state. It is an active commitment to shape one's life according to freely chosen values, even in the face of uncertainty.
And refusing to act is still a choice.
Still a choice for which you are responsible. This commitment to being the ultimate author of your own being, against the pressure of an indifferent universe is the ultimate act of self-creation. And he considered that to be truly heroic.
But that demand for constant self-creation and total responsibility is so intense, so draining. Psychologically, I think most people would recoil from it.
They do. The pressure to be the author of every moral choice, every action, every outcome, it is simply too much for many to bear. And this is where we encounter Sartre's concept of bad faith, or mauvaise foi.
Bad faith. That sounds deeply rooted in that fatalistic paralysis we talked about at the beginning.
It is. If absolute freedom is overwhelming and anxiety-inducing, we try to find a way out by pretending we are not free.
So it's a lie we tell ourselves.
It's a specific kind of lie. The drive is to escape the burden of being. Bad faith is a form of self-deception, where we deny our freedom by creating the illusion that our lives are determined by external roles, circumstances, or, as your friend suggested, fate.
The paradox is that you're using your freedom to deny that you're free.
That is the profound paradox.
Yeah.
You are lying to yourself while simultaneously knowing the truth.
The philosophical terms Sartre uses to describe this are incredibly useful for understanding modern identity. He differentiates between being in itself and being for itself. Could you break those down, maybe with a relatable example?
Certainly, being in itself, or en soi, refers to things that are fixed, static, and defined by their essence, like the paper knife or a rock. They simply are what they are.
They have no possibility.
Right. Being for itself, or pour soi, is human consciousness. It is characterized by lack, by possibility, and by continuous self-creation. It is defined by what it is not yet.
So bad faith is when the second thing tries to pretend it's the first thing.
Exactly. Bad faith is when the being for itself attempts to define itself as a fixed being in itself.
Yeah.
This is best illustrated by Sartre's famous example, the cafe waiter.
Yes, the man who is almost too much of a waiter.
He performs his role with this exaggerated, mechanical precision, a little too quickly, a little too smoothly, as if his movements were dictated by the very nature of waiting tables. He becomes so absorbed in the role that he sees himself as nothing but a waiter.
He treats this identity as fixed and necessary.
Yes, denying his possibility and his fundamental freedom. He's actively using his consciousness to suppress his consciousness.
But the paradox is that the waiter knows he is free. He has to know it on some level. He chooses to suppress that knowledge. It's an act of willful self-objectification.
That's it. He knows he can walk out the door right now and become something else, but he chooses to hide behind the label.
The person in bad faith adopts a role. A waiter, a good student, or a defeated failure, as if it were their entire identity, a fixed object, rather than recognizing it as a mask they chose to wear.
Or just a temporary project. When your friend told you, "I'm tired of fighting against a script I didn't write," he was living in bad faith. He was claiming his essence was failure, thus denying the ongoing existence that he could redefine at any moment. The first act of bad faith, Sartre suggests, is to flee what you cannot flee, to flee your own freedom.
This concept explains so much about why we feel trapped by our careers or our families or even our past mistakes. We've defined ourselves too rigidly by those external, fixed circumstances. We've turned ourselves into objects in our own minds.
And we don't exist in a vacuum, which complicates things even further. This freedom inevitably collides with others, leading to another famous and often misunderstood Sartrean declaration. Hell is other people.
That phrase from his play No Exit gets tossed around a lot to mean, I hate parties or something.
Right? Simple social annoyance. But it's far deeper than that. It describes the ontological conflict that arises because our freedom doesn't exist in isolation. The characters in the play are locked in a room where their true torment comes from the constant, inescapable exposure to each other's judgment and gaze.
How exactly does the presence of another person compromise my absolute freedom?
It happens through what he called the gaze of the other, or lieu regard. When another person looks at you, you become aware of yourself as being seen, and that awareness is devastating to your freedom. That gaze transforms you from a fluid, free subject, the being for itself, into a fixed object, the being in itself, in their perception. You lose control over who you are in their eyes.
So the waiter's internal self-deception, his bad faith, is replicated externally by every person who looks at him and sees only the waiter.
Exactly. He's not just denying his own freedom. Every customer is reinforcing his fixed object status.
Under the gaze of the other, you become a fixed object. The victim, the failure, the lover, the hero. You get trapped in a version of yourself you did not choose.
We are constantly at risk of being reduced to mere objects. Hell is not the person themselves, but the loss of freedom that comes from being eternally seen and fixed by someone else's eyes. Our deepest desire is to assert our own freedom, while the deepest desire of the other is to stabilize and categorize us. That conflict is the tragedy of human relationships.
This philosophical exploration of meaninglessness and freedom, it brings us to the ultimate crisis, the absurd, as confronted by Sartre's contemporary Albert Camus.
Right. While Sartre focused on freedom, Camus zeroed in on the inherent meaninglessness of the world.
Camus defined the absurd as the dissonance between our intrinsic human desire for meaning, our longing for order and purpose, and the universe's silent, cold indifference.
We scream for a rational explanation, and the universe merely offers an echo. It is absurd that we were born and absurd that we shall die. This collision leads to a profound existential void.
And the most famous representation of this crisis is, of course, the myth of Sisyphus.
It is. It presents the human condition as being like Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to an eternally meaningless task, pushing a rock up a hill, only to have it roll back down forever.
So if the task is futile and life is ultimately meaningless because everything we do will eventually be erased by entropy, Camus argues that we have a choice in how we respond: suicide, philosophical suicide, or revolt.
And Camus was very clear. Suicide, whether physical or philosophical, is an avoidance. Physical suicide negates ourselves and thus the absurdity.
And philosophical suicide.
That's turning to faith, or any system that posits a pre-written comforting meaning, like saying your suffering is fate or God's plan. It denies the premise of the meaningless universe.
He rejects both as dishonest.
Because they destroy the confrontation itself. They don't solve the problem, they just pretend it doesn't exist.
Which leaves revolt. What does this authentic response look like, and how is it maintained by Sisyphus?
Revolt, for Camus, is the act of living fully, of embracing the struggle, of discarding false hope, and being constantly aware of the meaninglessness, yet choosing to exist anyway.
So where is the moment of revolt for Sisyphus? It can't be when he's pushing the rock up.
No. The critical moment for Sisyphus is the walk back down the hill. When the boulder has rolled down, Sisyphus has a moment of respite and clarity. In that lucid moment, he recognizes the hopelessness and the futility of his task, but then he deliberately sets his shoulder back to the boulder.
The triumph isn't in moving the rock. It's in being conscious of the futility and choosing to act anyway.
Exactly. He is defying his fate by choosing to define the moment through his action, not by the external decree of the gods. He makes the meaningless task his. The happiness doesn't come from success or the belief in a reward, but from the deliberate act of engagement and defiance itself.
And Camus concluded,
the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. That's the ultimate act of self-creation in a world that gives you no instructions.
So we've moved from the practical management of externals with the Stoics to the radical acceptance of freedom with the existentialists. But how do we take this philosophical acceptance of the absurd and freedom and actually transition it toward practical application for mental health and resilience?
That's the key question, isn't it?
How do you leverage this intense freedom to actually construct a fulfilling life, moving past the philosophical terror?
This is where Viktor Frankl and his meaning-centered psychology, logotherapy, provide the crucial bridge. Frankl developed his theories from one of the most extreme situations imaginable: observation and survival in Nazi concentration camps. He watched who lived and who died, and his observations affirmed the ultimate human freedom.
His core observation was that the primary human drive is the will to meaning, not power, not pleasure.
Not the will to power, as Adler said, or the will to pleasure, as Freud said. If a person could find meaning, they could survive any suffering. This affirmed the ultimate freedom that remains available even in the worst situation possible, the freedom to choose one's attitude toward life.
It's the ultimate combination of the Stoic emphasis on control over attitude and the existentialist emphasis on absolute, defining freedom.
Perfectly put. Frankl found meaning by choosing to view his suffering not as pointless torment, but as an opportunity to observe human behavior and to make himself a better, stronger person, an act of self-creation under duress.
He transformed an existential crisis into an opportunity for growth.
He did. He recognized that suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning.
That concept, the freedom of attitude, is incredibly empowering, especially when you consider how often we feel completely stripped of agency by external circumstances, whether it's a concentration camp or a debilitating illness.
It is the ultimate non-negotiable freedom that cannot be taken away. And Frankl identified three principal ways this meaning can be created or discovered in life, which allowed people, even in the most brutal environments, to sustain their will to meaning.
Okay, let's detail those three paths because they provide a concrete framework for intentional living.
First, meaning is found through creative endeavors or work. This is the realization of a unique vocation or mission.
For Frankl himself, this was his manuscript.
It was the intense desire to survive in order to rewrite his lost manuscript about logotherapy, which was taken from him by the Nazis. It's about leaving something of yourself in the world that only you could create.
Okay, what's the second path?
Second, meaning is found through experiences, specifically the experience of love, nature, or relationships. He motivated himself by focusing on the image and memory of his wife, finding ultimate meaning in the bond of love, even if she was physically absent or potentially gone forever. These are moments of intense appreciation and connection.
And the third path, which is perhaps the hardest to grasp because it involves acceptance of the hardest truths, is meaning created through our attitude towards suffering.
Yes, this is the application of what he called tragic optimism, the ability to say yes to life in spite of everything, especially unavoidable suffering like guilt, pain, or death.
Suffering itself isn't inherently bad.
No, but it can be used as a whetstone to hone one's virtue and increase resilience. The attitude one adopts toward unavoidable suffering becomes a source of profound, unique meaning. It's choosing to face the absurd, not with nihilistic resignation, but with heroic defiance, just as Camus prescribed.
So meaning isn't a static treasure hunt. It's a dynamic, recursive process that continually evolves, often spurred on by a crisis. This sounds like logotherapy provides a practical psychological model for what Camus called revolt. It lets you manage the anxiety that comes with absolute freedom.
It provides the necessary mechanism. It moves you from pure philosophical endurance to psychological application. Frankl's approach emphasizes what he called noodynamics, the idea that mental health is maintained through a tension between what one has already done, the accomplishments, the fixed facts of the past, and what one hopes to accomplish, the future potential.
So you need that tension.
You need it. The search for meaning is not a gentle slide into contentment. It is a fundamental tension necessary for existence.
And crucially, existential crises, the loss of goals, illness, bereavement, or that overwhelming feeling of purposelessness, like my friend at the cafe, should be embraced as opportunities rather than fled from.
They act as a catalyst. When meaning-related crises occur, the process of meaning-making enables individuals to transform these challenges into opportunities for growth and development, which ultimately strengthens resilience.
If you define yourself by your fixed roles in bad faith, a crisis like job loss destroys you.
It does. But if you define yourself by your freedom and your capacity to create meaning through logotherapy and authenticity, the crisis becomes a prompt for self-reflection and the search for a new, deeper purpose. The outcome of this intentional crisis management is enhanced psychological well-being and life satisfaction.
This sounds fantastic in theory, but let's put a bow on this with a practical framework. If you are struggling with that sense of fatalistic paralysis, what are the actionable steps to transition from nihilism to intentional self-creation using all these integrated principles?
Okay, we can operationalize the principles of existential responsibility, stoic control, and Frankl's meaning-making into 4 core steps for intentional action to directly address that paralysis.
Number 1, setting personal goals. This is the first action after you accept your freedom.
This involves identifying and pursuing goals that are consistent with your personal values and intrinsic interests, rather than goals imposed by external expectations or societal definitions of success. It's about creating a purpose that is uniquely yours, your unique vocation.
And Frankl had a technique for this, didn't he?
He did. He advised using paradoxical intention. When you face anxiety or fear about an outcome, focus your goal not on avoiding the bad thing, but on welcoming it. It paradoxically releases the pressure of control and allows you to focus purely on the effort.
Number 2 would be developing self-awareness.
Yes. This requires ongoing, ruthless reflection on your inner life and your lived experiences. You must know what you value. This enables you to recognize your internal values and strength, the things you can control, which forms the necessary foundation for making purposeful choices.
This is the constant battle against bad faith. It requires admitting you are free, even when you wish you weren't.
It does. Number 3. Engaging in meaningful activities.
Meaning requires active commitment. It's not something you discover while waiting around.
No, it isn't. This means committing to pursuits that foster fulfillment and align with those core values you identified in the self-awareness phase. This is how you transform that philosophical freedom into material action. This is Sisyphus choosing to put his shoulder back to the boulder. The activity defines the meaning, not the other way around.
And the fourth, which feels like the core cornerstone that links all of this thinking together, Stoicism, existentialism, and logotherapy, is accepting responsibility.
Acknowledging, without any reservation, that you as the individual are ultimately accountable for your decisions and the life you create. This is the bedrock. You cannot wait for purpose to be handed to you, and you cannot blame fate when things become difficult. When you fully embrace your radical freedom, you take complete accountability for the meaning or lack thereof in your life. That acceptance, the recognition that you are the scriptwriter, is the ultimate act of empowerment. We started with the picture of someone defeated by the assumption of a pre-written script. What we've learned through Stoicism, existentialism, and logotherapy is that the narrative of your life is not only unwritten, it is unwinnable if you wait for purpose to be handed to you.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The universe may be indifferent, purposeless even, as modern cosmology suggests, but that external indifference simply shifts the entire locus of control and meaning into your hands.
The lack of inherent meaning is not a flaw. It's the raw material for creation.
Authenticity, purpose, and self-actualization emerge from conscious choice and intentional action.
You cannot escape your freedom.
But you can use it.
When you stop letting the assumption of a destined future dictate your present, you are released into the necessity of choice.
The person you are capable of becoming today is simply the result of the actions you choose to take, and the meaning of your life is nothing else but the sense you choose to give it.